Kristen Roberts had never been one to chase after suburban dreams. After 15 years of meticulous work in the state's food safety department and an emotionally draining divorce, she wasn't looking for perfection, just peace. When she closed on the modest two-story home in Westfield Ridge, a tree-lined enclave 20 minutes outside the city, she believed she had found exactly that. The house wasn't flashy, but it was solid. And more importantly, it sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac where she imagined she could finally decompress after years of personal and professional tension. No more shared walls. No more whispered arguments through drywall. Just her, a small garden patch she planned to revive, and the predictable rhythm of a quiet neighborhood. Her neighbors greeted her with polite smiles, some with the hesitancy of people unsure if the new face would fit the culture. Most stayed at a distance, which suited her just fine. All except the woman next door, Karen Harding. Thick-voiced and always moving like the center of gravity pulled toward her, Karen made herself known within a week. She arrived uninvited one Saturday morning, holding a tray of peach cobbler and talking nonstop, before Kristen had even opened the screen door. She introduced herself as sort of the event wrangler around here, referencing everything from weekly wine tastings to casual community BBQs that, according to her, could get pretty wild, but in a classy way. She spoke fast, smiled hard, and gestured constantly as if conducting an orchestra no one else could hear. Kristen nodded through it, thanked her for the cobbler, and let her know she worked long hours and preferred quiet evenings. Karen laughed, waving it off. "You'll warm up to us. This street doesn't do the whole loner thing." Kristen had encountered many Karens in her line of work. People who believed rules were elastic when applied to them, who smiled with their mouths but not their eyes, who used charm as a smokescreen for control. She remained polite, but wary. Over the next few weeks, she watched Karen's routine unfold like clockwork. By noon most days, Karen's driveway hosted at least one oversized SUV with tinted windows. Music often floated over the fence, low but persistent. Garden lights blinked in sync at night, as if preparing for a party that never really ended. And it wasn't just her own property Karen treated like a playground. She casually rearranged trash bins along the curb, claimed unassigned parking spots for visiting guests, and once even left a handwritten note on Kristen's mailbox asking if she could trim the hedge just a bit to better match the neighborhood. Aesthetic. Kristen didn't respond. She tried to ignore it, until one Friday morning a crew arrived at Karen's home, unloading catering trays, sound equipment, and string lights by the dozen. By noon, folding tables were being set up across the front lawn. A bartender was testing a portable cocktail station, and guests started arriving long before the sun dipped low. But what caught Kristen's attention wasn't the noise or the intrusion. It was the sight of Karen's massive black Escalade parked across the fire lane. Not just close to it, across it. Bold, blocking it entirely. Kristen stood at her kitchen window, watching the Escalade slowly come to a stop. It wasn't parked diagonally. It wasn't edging the lane by accident. Karen had driven it straight across the designated fire access, aligned the front bumper with her mailbox, and left it like a monument to arrogance. Kristen knew the markings well. Bright red curbs with emergency access only stenciled in white, freshly painted just weeks ago by the city. She took a slow breath and stepped outside, crossing the street toward Karen, who was now giving directions to a delivery crew, unloading crates of champagne flutes. She kept her voice even. "Karen, you can't leave your car like that. That's a fire lane. If there's an emergency, they won't be able to get through." Karen didn't even turn fully around. "Oh, it's just for tonight," she called over her shoulder. "I've had guests take that curb when they park too close to the sidewalk. I'm not trying to get sued." Kristen tried again, a bit firmer this time. "I'm not trying to be difficult, but that's a direct violation. If something happens..." Karen turned now, smiling, her voice loud enough for others nearby to hear. "Well, sweetie, I've been here 17 years and never had a fire. You're new, I get it. Still figuring things out. But trust me, nobody's ever had a problem. We've got 3 cops and a nurse on this block. If something really bad happened, we'd be fine." She winked, then turned her back as if that closed the conversation. Kristen walked away before saying something she'd regret. She didn't want to escalate a neighbor conflict over one evening. Maybe it would blow over. Maybe the Escalade would be moved once more guests arrived. But deep down, she knew better. Karen didn't forget things. She made statements, And this was a message. I park where I want. You're not in charge. By 6:30, the street was packed. Cars lined both sides, creeping into driveways not their own. Music pulsed from hidden speakers in Karen's backyard, spilling into the quiet air with manufactured cheer. The fire lane remained blocked. Kristen noticed a few guests pointing toward the Escalade and laughing as they sipped from plastic tumblers. She stayed inside, pretending to read, while the bass from someone's remix thudded in her walls. Around 8, a young woman ran down the street, barefoot and frantic. She was no older than 25, and shouting something Kristen couldn't make out. Kristen opened the front door just as the girl reached the curb, clutching her phone, crying, "He can't breathe. He's allergic. He found nuts in one of the sliders. We need an ambulance." It was chaos. 2 men ran behind her, waving their arms toward Karen's backyard. One was shouting for someone to call 911 while the other was already on the phone. A child, maybe 6 or 7, was being carried out, limp and wheezing, his chest hitching as he struggled to inhale. Karen rushed forward holding a wet cloth, shouting at the group to bring him inside where it was cooler, completely missing the urgency. "He's fine," she kept saying. "Let's not make a scene." Someone else shouted that the ambulance was coming. That's when Kristen felt her stomach drop. She looked toward the blocked lane. There was no way a fire truck or EMT vehicle could get through. No space, no visibility. The Escalade was angled across the lane like a barricade. She didn't wait. Kristen ran inside, grabbed her phone, and called dispatch. "There's a medical emergency at 49 Westfield Ridge," she said, "but the fire lane is blocked by a black SUV. They won't be able to get through. You'll need to come from the backside through Pine Hill entrance. Tell them now." Within minutes, flashing lights appeared in the distance, but as predicted, they came to a sudden stop. Sirens howled, then died as the vehicle's approach was cut off. The paramedics climbed out and began hauling gear down the street by foot. A fire truck rolled in behind them, nudging forward until its front bumper kissed the tailgate of the Escalade. There was no way around. The firefighters didn't hesitate. One of them pointed toward the truck, another toward the car. The third, a woman with a shaved head and jaw like a blade, lifted a red-handled axe and walked straight toward the SUV. Karen was screaming by then, waving her arms, trying to stop them. "You can't touch that! It's private property. You'll hear from my lawyer." The firefighter didn't respond. She swung once, then again, and the glass exploded outward. The child was already being carried down the sidewalk on a stretcher, but no one looked away from the Escalade as the door was forced open with hydraulic tools. The party stopped. The music cut. The lights kept blinking, but everyone just stood there, slack-jawed and silent, watching Karen shriek and plead while strangers dismantled her car to save a life. Kristen didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just stood quietly behind her closed screen door, watching the chaos unfold, her hands clenched so tight they shook. She hadn't wanted this, but part of her knew. It was always going to happen. All it took was one real emergency for reality to bulldoze delusion. The next morning, Kristen woke to a knock at the door, not sharp or hurried, but steady and deliberate. She opened it to find a man in a gray windbreaker, clipboard in hand, badge barely visible under his jacket. He introduced himself as a representative from the city's Code Enforcement Division. Polite but curt, he informed her that someone had submitted a formal complaint alleging repeated violations of landscaping regulations on her property, specifically citing overgrown hedges, improperly stored waste bins, and an unauthorized fence. Height. Kristen blinked at him in disbelief, glancing toward her yard, which had been trimmed and cleaned only 3 days prior. She asked if the complaint was anonymous. He said yes, but the paper trail would be logged. He handed her a printed warning and walked off, already moving to the next address. She stood frozen for a moment before stepping outside to survey her lawn. Everything was exactly as it had been, neat, orderly, unremarkable. This wasn't about aesthetics, it was retaliation, petty and precise. Karen had struck the first real blow, and she'd done it not with shouting or confrontation, but through channels, the kind that looked official and left a paper trail that could be waved off as a misunderstanding. Kristen folded the paper and went back inside without a word. The fallout from the party came swiftly. Word had spread through the neighborhood, but the narrative was twisted in small, strategic ways. Kristen overheard fragments while checking her mailbox. Overreacted. Could have moved the car in 2 minutes. It wasn't even a real emergency. Trying to make someone look bad. She noticed that the tone had shifted, not openly hostile, but wary. People who had previously nodded or waved began averting their eyes. One woman crossed the street entirely as Kristen walked toward her. 3 days after the incident, Kristen received a letter from her home insurance provider. The language was vague, but the implication was clear. Due to ongoing neighborhood tension and liability concerns, her premium was being reevaluated. It wasn't a cancellation yet, but a warning. Kristen called the agent she'd worked with for years, but he sounded distant, uncomfortable. Look, I'm just relaying what came down from underwriting. It's probably temporary, but someone filed a report that your property was involved in a disruptive event with emergency services. They flagged the address. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. Karen had found a way to strike where it hurt. Through systems, through institutions that didn't ask many questions. Kristen understood this kind of warfare. It was slow, procedural, and devastatingly effective. She wasn't being attacked with fists or threats. She was being eroded. Later that week, Kristen returned from work to find a box left on her front steps. No label, no note. Inside was a heap of old party decorations, broken balloons, confetti, even a crumpled banner that read, "Splash Zone." It smelled like chlorine and stale alcohol. Someone had taken the remnants of the ruined party and dumped them at her door. She didn't report it. She just cleaned it up, bagged it, and threw it in the bin without a word. The next evening, her garbage wasn't collected. Every other bin on the street was emptied and wheeled back neatly by sanitation workers. Hers stood alone, untouched. She contacted the Waste Services Department and was told her address had been temporarily removed from the active pickup list due to a conflict regarding bin placement. Kristen pressed, demanded a supervisor. Eventually, someone admitted a complaint had been filed by a resident on her street, citing obstruction of the sidewalk. Her bin had been placed 2 inches past the imaginary line Karen had referenced weeks ago in her passive-aggressive note. That night, Kristen sat down and began compiling everything. The complaint notice, the insurance letter, the photo of the fire lane blockage, the footage from her door camera showing the box of trash. She wasn't preparing a lawsuit. She was preparing a firewall. She sent it to her lawyer, not because she planned on suing, but because she needed documentation. She knew how these things could spiral, how narratives could be shaped over time if you didn't hold on to the facts. Her lawyer agreed to quietly monitor any future escalations and advised her to avoid direct confrontations. Kristen agreed, but she felt the tension growing. Days turned into a tense routine. Kristen would wake, check her lawn, her mailbox, her driveway, always half expecting to find something new, some fresh insult disguised as procedure. Karen, for her part, remained publicly cheerful, waving at neighbors, hosting afternoon wine circles that never seemed to end. The street came alive with a kind of performative friendliness, but Kristen saw through it. No one said her name, but everyone glanced too long when she passed. One night, she returned from the grocery store to find her side gate unlatched. She was meticulous about locking it, always double-checking. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed, but as she walked along the perimeter, she noticed footprints in the mulch lining her garden. Wide, shallow, not hers. The gate's lock had been tampered with. Scratches along the base of the latch as if someone had fumbled with a key or tried to wedge something inside. She didn't call the police. There wasn't enough for a report, but she logged it, took photos, added it to the folder. The real blow came a week later. A second complaint was filed, this one directly to the city council, alleging that Kristen had repeatedly harassed a neighbor, created a hostile environment, and incited damage to private property. The wording was surgical, clearly reviewed by someone with legal fluency, and although it didn't name Karen, it referenced the date of the fire lane incident. Kristen's address was again flagged for review, and a neighborhood ombudsman requested a voluntary mediation to de-escalate tensions between adjacent parties. Kristen didn't decline, but she asked for the full text of the complaint. When it arrived, redacted but still damning, she read it 3 times. It painted her as a vindictive, aggressive woman who had made unfounded accusations, disrupted a community event, and manipulated emergency responders for personal gain. It was fiction, but detailed fiction. Someone had gone to great lengths to build a case that didn't just discredit her, but framed her as the threat. She closed the document, exhaled slowly, and realized the truth. This wasn't about the SUV, the music, or even the fire lane. It was about territory. Karen wasn't punishing Kristen for a single incident. She was asserting control over the street, over the narrative, over the perception of who belonged and who didn't. And Kristen, by refusing to play along, had become a problem, a liability, an enemy. Kristen arrived early to the mediation, choosing a seat near the window in the neutral municipal building that smelled faintly of floor wax and old printer toner. The room was small but formal, furnished with a long, laminated table, a whiteboard no one would use, and chairs arranged with clinical symmetry. She wore a plain navy blouse, slacks, no jewelry, minimal makeup. Presentation mattered, especially when someone had spent weeks painting her as erratic. She kept her folder close, documents in order, photos of the fire lane, timestamps, written warnings, and her correspondence with the city. She wasn't there to argue. She was there to be undeniable. Karen arrived 7 minutes late, dressed in a bold floral blazer over white linen pants, her oversized leather purse slung over one shoulder. Her expression was that of someone entering a brunch, not a conflict resolution. She beamed as she stepped in, greeting the ombudsman with a handshake like they were old colleagues. She offered Kristen a smile too, thin and loaded with calculation, then settled into her chair with an exaggerated sigh, as though she'd been dragged into the room under protest. The ombudsman, a compact woman in her 50s with the tone of a kindergarten teacher managing a sandpit fight, began with introductions and an explanation of purpose. This is not a court. This is not a venue for assigning blame. It's an opportunity to identify miscommunications and rebuild harmony. Kristen listened carefully, nodding when appropriate, making notes with her pen. Karen, by contrast, appeared relaxed, even indulgent. When it was her turn to speak, she leaned forward and began with what sounded like a rehearsed laugh. Oh goodness, I honestly didn't expect all this from just one party. I mean, yes, there was an incident, and yes, my car was unfortunately in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this... She gestured vaguely toward Kristen. This feels a little overblown. I've lived in this neighborhood for nearly 2 decades, hosted hundreds of events, never had a single emergency until that one evening. And believe me, no one feels worse than I do about what happened to that little boy. But we've all moved on, haven't we? It's been addressed. The paramedics responded quickly, and everyone's fine. This endless focus on blame, it's unhealthy. Kristen did not interrupt. She let Karen speak, watching her shape the narrative like clay, rounding the edges of responsibility until nothing sharp remained. She waited for the ombudsman to nod, then quietly opened her folder, extracted the fire department's report, and placed it on the table. The child spent 3 days in intensive care, she said evenly. He stopped breathing for nearly 2 minutes. The report confirms the delay caused by the blocked lane extended response time by 11 minutes. That's not a miscommunication, that's negligence. Karen's smile didn't fade, but her fingers tightened on the strap of her purse. With all due respect, she said, voice softening into condescension, I think you're letting emotion cloud your view. I was trying to protect my property. I've had issues with sidewalk scuffing and bumper scrapes. We all make choices and sometimes things go wrong. But to turn this into some sort of campaign against me, it's excessive. And frankly, it's begun to feel like harassment. Kristen raised her brows slightly, then slid forward the garbage complaint form, the city council letter, and a printout of the waste services email showing her bin was deliberately removed from collection. I haven't campaigned against anyone, she replied. I've responded to each escalation with appropriate channels. I've documented, not retaliated. The pattern of complaints filed against me, most within 48 hours of our last interaction, is a matter of public record. If you want to talk about harassment, we can. Karen scoffed, eyes darting toward the ombudsman as if to appeal for rescue. This is exactly what I'm talking about, she said, her voice rising slightly. Everything is a file, a report, a paper trail. That's not how communities function. We talk, we forgive, we move on. This is surveillance, not citizenship. The ombudsman paused, scribbled something, then gently guided the discussion towards solutions. Kristen suggested new signage for the fire lane, formal citations for repeated blockages, and a neutral third party to oversee community event planning. Karen bristled, called the suggestions bureaucratic overreach, and offered instead to be more mindful of her parking in the future. The session ended without resolution. After the meeting, Kristen walked briskly to her car. She sat behind the wheel, the silence of the cabin a sharp contrast to the forced politeness of the conference room. She wasn't rattled, not exactly, but she felt the weight of something settling deeper. Karen wasn't going to stop. She wasn't just defending herself, she was rewriting the narrative in real time, creating a version of events where she was the misunderstood hostess and Kristen the obsessed outsider. The next morning, Kristen found a small card wedged into her mailbox. No envelope. A white square with embossed lettering that read, "You're not making friends. Think about your future here." There was no signature, no fingerprint, just that cold, elegant threat. She called her lawyer again. He advised installing visible security cameras. "It won't stop her," he said, "but it changes the calculus. People behave differently when they know they're being recorded." Kristen had them up within 2 days. 2 at the front, 1 in the backyard. She didn't hide them. That was the point. A quiet announcement. "I see you," Karen responded with a smile the next time they crossed paths. "Nice new toys," she said brightly. "Just be careful where you point them. Some of us value our privacy." Kristen didn't answer, but later that week the footage caught something unexpected. A man she didn't recognize, early 30s, jeans and a polo shirt, stepping into her driveway around 2 in the morning. He looked around, paused, and walked toward her side yard. He didn't try the door, didn't force anything, but he left a small black bag near her trash bins before casually walking back into the street. Kristen retrieved the bag carefully the next morning. Inside were shards of broken glass, wet coffee grounds, and what looked like the gutted remains of a small animal trap. Nothing illegal, but unsettling in its deliberate ambiguity. She called it in. The police took a report, but without clear evidence of wrongdoing, there was little they could do. Still, the event was logged, and her lawyer added it to the growing file. That weekend, Karen hosted another gathering. Smaller this time, but no less performative. A hand-painted sign near the entrance read, "Neighborhood Resilience Celebration." Kristen watched from her window as a group of guests clinked glasses and laughed loudly. Pausing occasionally to glance toward her house, Karen stood at the center, animated and glowing, the undisputed queen of a world she'd crafted from perception and charm. Kristen didn't watch long. She went back to her office and resumed work on her formal complaint to the city. Not the passive complaints Karen filed to weaponize bureaucracy, but a structured factual submission outlining harassment patterns, coordinated social targeting, and safety violations. Her documentation was extensive now: dates, photos, witness accounts, official correspondence. She wasn't trying to win a popularity contest. She was building a case, and she was almost ready to make it public. The following week began with a dull tension that didn't seem to lift no matter how ordinary the weather or how calm the street appeared. Kristen moved through her days with clinical precision. Work, errands, quiet meals, document management, and nightly reviews of her camera footage. She had grown accustomed to being methodical because it was the only thing that made sense amid the distorted theater her neighbor continued to orchestrate. Karen, meanwhile, had not let the mediation deter her. If anything, she had doubled down on her strategy. Only now the tactics had shifted from procedural attacks to social sabotage. It started small again. An older couple from 2 doors down, people Kristen had previously shared cordial greetings with, suddenly wouldn't meet her eyes. When she passed them during their morning walk, they turned their heads just enough to acknowledge her presence without actually looking. Her next-door neighbor on the opposite side, a woman who had once borrowed Kristen's gardening shears and returned them with cookies, began avoiding her entirely. Packages began arriving late. Her mail came crumpled, damp, or with torn corners. Nothing provable, nothing dramatic, just the slow erosion of normalcy that had once made the neighborhood seem peaceful. Then, early one Friday morning, Kristen walked out to find her car door slightly ajar. Nothing had been stolen, but the glove box had been opened and its contents rifled through. Manuals, registration papers, a bottle of hand sanitizer, all tossed haphazardly across the passenger seat. Her center console had been emptied, too. She checked her camera footage, but the angle only captured movement near the driveway. Shadows and shapes, but no face, no license plate. She filed a police report again, knowing full well what the response would be. Without witnesses, fingerprints, or video evidence, it was just another incident logged and shelved. But it wasn't the intrusion that got to her. It was the message. Someone had wanted her to know they could get that close. Not to take, not to vandalize, but to unsettle. The same day, she received an email from her property management platform indicating a violation had been reported against her account, submitted by a verified neighborhood representative. The accusation? Hosting unauthorized rentals. The absurdity of it was so sharp it made her laugh because she lived alone, owned the house, and had never listed it anywhere. Yet there it was. A screenshot of a listing on a popular vacation rental site, featuring photos that looked eerily like her home. The interior shots weren't real, but the exterior, blurred, filtered, and taken from across the street, matched her porch lights and window shutters. The listing had been created anonymously just days earlier with a booking schedule set to unavailable, making it appear dormant and unprovable. Kristen immediately filed a takedown request, contacted the platform's fraud department, and sent the details to her attorney. He confirmed what she already suspected. Someone was trying to fabricate the appearance of violations that could eventually justify formal HOA action or insurance revocation. Another cut, sharp and clean, designed to draw blood over time. What followed was perhaps the most overt move yet. That Saturday evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood and soft porch lights began to flicker on, Kristen's cameras caught something new. A group of teenagers, maybe 5 or 6, standing near her driveway with paper cups and portable speakers. The music wasn't loud, but it was intentionally directed toward her home. They loitered, laughed, and called out random words. Not insults, just noise. One of them began skateboarding up and down the sidewalk, deliberately tapping the board's tail near her front steps. Kristen watched them for 10 minutes before stepping outside and calmly asking them to move along. One of the boys said something about open property and everyone's invited, before flicking the remains of his drink toward her garden bed and walking off without apology. She didn't chase them. She just noted the time, saved the footage, and reported the disturbance. The next day, her trash bin was found overturned, its contents scattered across her driveway. It was clear now that the attacks weren't only coming from Karen directly, but from people she enabled, nudged, or emboldened through gossip and suggestion. Kristen began noticing familiar faces at her window. People who had no business on her side of the street lingered near her mailbox, turned and walked slowly past her yard as if scanning for something worth reporting. It wasn't paranoia. It was a campaign, a slow, relentless effort to wear her down until leaving seemed easier than fighting. Kristen's lawyer recommended pressing further with the city, not just documenting incidents, but requesting a formal audit of neighborhood governance. How reports were handled, who submitted them, and whether any patterns emerged that could reveal bad faith actions. He drafted the request, citing precedent from a nearby community where a similar pattern of organized harassment had resulted in public disciplinary measures and the removal of certain representatives from advisory roles. The city acknowledged the request, promised an internal review, but cautioned that such processes could take months. Meanwhile, Karen remained radiant in her performance. She organized a community renewal brunch on the front lawn, complete with branded signs and a table full of glossy flyers advertising local vendors. No permits were filed, no parking adjustments were made, and once again her oversized Escalade returned to its familiar place. Across the same fire lane, now with a sunshade in the windshield and 2 folding chairs leaned against the bumper like it was part of the landscaping. When Kristen took photos and submitted them to the fire department, the response came faster than before. A violation notice was issued within 48 hours, citing previous warnings. Karen posted the notice on her social media and tagged it, "Trask's Petty Neighbors," spinning the citation into a badge of martyrdom, gaining dozens of comments supporting her supposed fight against neighborhood control freaks. Kristen didn't respond. She just kept archiving. Every comment, every photo, every retaliatory act. When a new complaint arrived stating she had verbally intimidated a food delivery driver, something that never happened, she requested the identity of the complainant. The platform wouldn't release it, citing privacy, but her lawyer filed a motion demanding access if further legal steps were taken. The mask was slipping. The pattern was becoming visible to more than just her. One night, around 3 a.m., she awoke to the smell of burning plastic. Alarmed, she ran to the window and saw nothing, but when she stepped outside, the scent was unmistakable. Something acrid and wrong. She found it in the side alley behind her fence, a smoldering heap of garbage bags likely pulled from her own trash, doused in lighter fluid and ignited just long enough to singe the edges before fizzling out. It hadn't caught fully. Maybe the culprit got spooked. Maybe it was a warning. Kristen called the fire department. They responded quietly, took samples, and filed a report. No one was arrested, but this time she saw it in their faces. They knew something wasn't right here. The silence on the street the next morning was suffocating. Kristen walked her perimeter, watering the singed patch of grass with slow, deliberate care. She didn't speak. She didn't greet the man walking his dog or the woman sweeping her porch. She simply moved, methodically, calculating her next step. She would not leave. Not when the game had become so blatant. Not when the people who once watched from a distance had started looking nervous. Karen had built her empire on charm and coercion, but Kristen had learned the rules now and she was no longer playing defense. The fire marshal didn't knock. He rang the doorbell and waited, clipboard in hand, uniform crisp, face unreadable beneath the morning glare. Kristen opened the door cautiously, her eyes scanning past him for signs of cameras, reporters, or uninvited guests. He introduced himself simply, stated his department, and asked if he could have a few minutes of her time to discuss the complaint she had filed regarding repeated obstruction of emergency access. She stepped aside and gestured him in, leading him to the kitchen where a stack of folders already lay waiting. Without dramatics or editorializing, she presented everything. Photographs of Karen's SUV blocking the fire lane, time-stamped videos, screenshots of community posts, correspondence from the fire department, and the city's own warning letter that had been ignored. He didn't interrupt. He took notes in short, efficient strokes, occasionally asking for clarification. When he finished, he looked up and nodded, not a confirmation of guilt or agreement, but acknowledgement. The kind of nod that said, "This isn't nothing." 2 days later, official trucks rolled down the street with the quiet finality of people who had done this many times before. City workers painted bold diagonal stripes across the fire lane, embedded metal signage into the curb, and installed 2 short posts with reflectors and locking bollards to physically prevent vehicles from blocking the space. It was surgical, precise, and public. Neighbors emerged from their homes watching the installation from porches and behind curtains, trying not to be obvious. Kristen stood across the street with her arms folded, expression blank. Karen came out 10 minutes into the operation, her phone already in hand, barefoot on her lawn, robe fluttering as she spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I wasn't even consulted," she told the phone. "This is harassment, plain and simple. I'm calling legal. This is a violation of property rights. They didn't even give me notice." No one answered her. The workers kept going, hammering steel into cement, unbothered by her posturing. One of them politely asked her to step back when she wandered too close. Another handed her a copy of the work order, signed and sealed by the city. She took it, crumpled it, and threw it on her lawn. Kristen watched her unravel. Not loudly, not theatrically. Quietly, internally, with a twitch in her jaw and fingers that didn't stop moving. That evening, a citywide emergency safety bulletin was circulated via email and postal mail to all residents, outlining the new fire lane enforcement policy and citing recent violations. Though no names were mentioned, the dates and location were unmistakable. The fire department released a public service message reminding residents that obstruction of emergency access was not only a civil infraction, but could result in felony charges if injuries occurred due to delayed response. It was a rare move, impersonal in tone but surgically directed. Karen's response was immediate. That same night, she posted a video online, speaking into her phone from her front porch. Her face was tear-streaked, mascara smudged, voice trembling in practiced rhythm. She told a story of betrayal, of being bullied by a newcomer who didn't understand our community, and painted herself as a victim of an overreaching government that had targeted her for being outspoken. She spoke about losing trust in neighbors, and ended with a plea for understanding, saying she was considering leaving the neighborhood because she no longer felt safe. The comments under the video were mixed. Some offered sympathy, others questioned her account. A few posted links to the city's safety bulletin. But what struck Kristen most was the silence from within the neighborhood. No one came to her defense. No one reposted her story. No one left flowers at her door or wrote long Facebook replies about injustice. The only response Karen received was absence. The quiet vacuum that follows when people begin distancing themselves from a sinking ship. The final blow came not from Kristen, not from the fire department, and not even from the city. It came from the insurance company. The Escalade, already damaged during the original fire lane incident, had sat for weeks in the same spot. Unregistered, with a cracked rear windshield and growing citations for non-compliance. The adjuster's report had been delayed, but once it landed, the outcome was devastating. Not only was the claim denied due to willful obstruction of a designated emergency route, but the company also issued a formal review of Karen's entire property coverage, citing a pattern of policy conflicts and risk behavior. Within a week, her premiums tripled. Within a month, she was dropped entirely. Kristen learned about it not through gossip, but through official documentation shared with her lawyer, as part of the city's follow-up process. She didn't celebrate, she didn't gloat. She just filed the papers and kept her cameras running. Karen, meanwhile, began withdrawing. The music stopped, the parties ceased. Her porch, once lit with string lights and decorative lanterns, went dark. The SUV was finally towed, not by city order, but by a private service hired late at night. Kristen saw it happen from her upstairs window. Karen pacing the lawn, yelling at the driver, threatening legal action that never materialized. By the time the next safety meeting was held, Karen didn't attend. She wasn't removed from any list, wasn't formally sanctioned, but her influence evaporated like steam from a broken pipe. No one followed her lead. No one mentioned her name. And when her house went up for sale quietly 3 weeks later, with a modest sign and no fanfare, the silence around it felt like closure. Kristen didn't walk past it. She didn't even slow down. She had nothing left to prove. Summer crept in slowly that year, the air turning warmer without ceremony, the trees thickening with leaves that shimmered in the wind like they had nothing left to witness. The street, once charged with undercurrents of tension, now moved with a quieter rhythm. The lawnmowers buzzed at predictable hours. Dogs barked, kids played, sprinklers clicked in rotating arcs. Kristen still woke early each day, checked her cameras, walked her property line with a practiced eye, but the dread that had once knotted in her stomach had dulled. It hadn't vanished. People like her didn't believe in perfect peace. But it had receded into the background, like an old scar that stopped aching, but never quite disappeared. Karen's house sold within 6 weeks. No goodbye party, no farewell barbecue. One day, a moving truck arrived, and by sundown, her lights were off. The new owners arrived 3 days later, a couple in their late 40s with a teenage daughter who waved at Kristen without hesitation. They brought no noise, no declarations, no territorial charm. Just a few potted plants and a quiet determination to settle in. Kristen didn't make a show of anything. She didn't tell the new neighbors about the past, didn't warn them or offer unsolicited advice. She smiled when appropriate, kept her interactions polite and brief, and watched the block slowly reset itself. It wasn't about winning. It had never been. It was about preservation, of space, of boundaries, of sanity. She had never set out to drive anyone away, but she had refused to be pushed out herself. And that had been the line Karen hadn't expected her to hold. Weeks passed. The fire lane remained clear. The new bollard stood firm. Packages arrived on time. Her trash was collected like clockwork. People she hadn't spoken to in months began nodding again. Small gestures, cautious acknowledgments, as if testing the air. She didn't chase their approval, but when one of them asked if she'd be interested in joining the community safety committee, she said yes, not out of ambition, but because now she understood what silence could cost. On a Sunday morning, Kristen stood by her front window with a cup of coffee, watching the street breathe easily for the first time in months. No noise, no drama, just a neighborhood being what it was supposed to be. And for the first time since she moved in, she didn't feel like she was guarding something. She felt like she was home.